Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Metropolis Radio. Today we are talking about modern science fiction and the fact that it is trending toward darker stories. But before we dive any deeper, guys, just remember that not all of my videos are going to be coming to the YouTube channel. Some will only be coming to my BitChute, Odyssey, and Rumble channels. So if you're watching this on YouTube and you have not started following me on at least one of those three alternative sites, the links to those are down in the description below. But anyway, guys, let's get into this article here from Gamer, aptly titled, "Is Modern Science Fiction Trending Toward Darker Stories?" Sci-fi commonly focuses on themes that reveal issues in society, so does its recent popularity of darker content reflect a deeper problem? Since the beginning of science fiction's popularity in the 50s and 60s, it has been a genre that was far enough removed from human reality that it could be used to evaluate humanity without being too direct. For decades now, authors and screenwriters alike have told tales of captivating, futuristic worlds that are meant to both appeal to the audience and cause them to reflect on themselves and the world they live in. Since its beginning, science fiction, especially in the film format, has pushed barriers and been rather progressive in its content and characters. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is Star Trek, with its diverse characters and cast, as well as plots that mirror common problems in the real world that need to be pointed out and addressed. Yeah, in some of those episodes of Star Trek, particularly TOS, had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to a glass table. When you had the war between people with the black face on the left side of the face and the white face on the right side, and then the other group of people had the white face on the left side and then the black face on the right side. Yeah, like I said, some of those, had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to a glass table. Historically, art as a whole has always been used to communicate ideas and lessons, especially in settings where it would have been forbidden to openly speak out against a practice or person in society. As art has evolved inevitably, so too have the practices in which it's created and the messages and ideas that it focuses on. However, because life imitates art and vice versa, these changes likely reflect much more than just time passing. Several current popular examples of science fiction shows and movies utilize a darker tone in order to highlight a certain aspect of the plot. For one example, Raised by Wolves, a 2020 television series, focuses on the relationship between people and technology and how that relationship connects to humanity's constant tension surrounding varying religious beliefs. Now, to be fair, Raised by Wolves I believe that's the show that Ridley Scott is behind, and that was the idea that he had for the sequel to Alien Covenant. He's been very open in interviews within the last few years, saying that's where he wanted to take his third Alien movie, after Prometheus and Alien Covenant. He wanted to, focus on the relationship between people and technology. So the fact that, that Raised by Wolves is focusing on it, and the fact that Ridley Scott is behind it, honestly doesn't shock me. It handles some considerably controversial topics and touches on emotional points, revealing in the process several aspects of modern society that are problematic and potentially dangerous. Westworld and Interstellar are also current examples that point out an element in society that is meant to benefit us, but actually dehumanizes us in some way. In Westworld, audiences see another critical view of how people interact with advanced forms of technology, becoming so reliant on it that it becomes an interwoven part of our reality. And keep in mind that HBO's Westworld is actually a remake of a movie from 1973 starring Yul Brynner that actually had its own sequel. That was 1976's Future World. Interstellar examines humanity's desire to have domain in space and how the pursuit could easily get in the way of human existence on Earth in the present. Though the best example of this darkening of the theme in science fiction media may be seen in Black Mirror. Black Mirror was immediately recognized as being inspired by the Twilight Zone, both through its short episodic structure and the way the theme of each episode points to people's errors, the consequences of which stretch even beyond our own universe. In the Twilight Zone, each episode does archive this ability to reflect a problematic component of society, but it is generally done in a lighter tone, considering the time period in which it was made. While it would handle plenty of creative and sometimes eerie science fiction concepts, it wasn't as horrifying as Black Mirror. Black Mirror, on the other hand, does not refrain from using more mature content or some straight up disturbing stories to get its message across. By using this darker and arguably more upsetting approach, the creators guaranteed that the themes of each episode would warrant a bigger response from the audience and thus be more likely to have a long-lasting impact on them. That said, it was not likely that their intention to use darker content to traumatize the audience, but rather to emphasize the direness of the problems being forced on. Given that science fiction has been around for generations now, and it often possesses many of the same tropes, it's clear that it's been pointing out some of the same problems for years. That is likely the biggest reason for the recent popularity of darker shows and movies in the science fiction genre, to illustrate that these repeated concepts need to be taken seriously, or there could be severe consequences. In other words, it's possible that this trend is a sort of intensified attempt to get the theme across to the audience in such a way that they embody it. Regardless of the exact motivating factor behind darkening the content in sci-fi, it has undoubtedly created a whole new layer to the genre, given that most science fiction stories are set in a universe of reality outside our own. By darkening the tone of a story, the world it exists in is also darkened and serves as an example or lesson to the audience. The worlds in these stories somehow connect to our own, and by creating this dark version that makes the audience uncomfortable, they achieve the point of showing the viewers what's at stake for the future of the human species. Considering the many recent events that have affected society as a whole, like the pandemic, the political climate, and all the fighting and tension happening in the world, it makes sense that we have seen science fiction becoming increasingly more intense as the future of humanity is looking the same way. Again, life and art mirror each other. As long as issues in society continue to fester and go unresolved, it's likely that the stories we're seen in speculative genres like science fiction will continue to reflect that. Now, guys, let's actually go back to an earlier point here. And what is that? It's right here. Given that science fiction has been around for generations now, and it often possesses many of the same tropes, it's clear it's been pointing out some of the same problems for years. That is likely the biggest reason for the recent popularity of darker shows and movies in the science fiction genre, to illustrate the repeated concepts that need to be taken seriously, or there could be severe consequences. See, I would argue that the reason for the popularity of darker science fiction is the fact that science fiction got way too campy for too long. Let me explain. Okay, you have to understand why Star Wars succeeded at the time. It's because in the 1970s, a lot of these movies were getting very darker, very dreary, very depressing, and then all of a sudden, here comes Star Wars. That's very uplifting. That's a very uplifting piece of media. That's not just science fiction. But then what happened? Other studios started to copy it, and they started to make all of the other science fiction very uplifting and very positive, and that led to some very, very campy science fiction movies. I mean, look at 1980s Flash Gordon, or the movie Battle Beyond the Stars. That's with George Peppard, and ironically enough, Roger Corman himself was behind that movie, so that probably explains the campiness. But there is a butt-fuck ton of other examples of science fiction getting way too campy, really starting in the 80s and 90s. And what really kicked off the science fiction movie towards darker stories, some would argue, was Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. I would argue it was more 2004's Battlestar Galactica, a reboot of a very campy sci-fi show that came out in the late 70s. Yes, as a response to Star Wars. You go back and watch the original Battlestar Galactica, it's extremely campy, but how did the reboot handle it? The reboot handled it by making it very dark and very gritty, and all of a sudden everyone started chasing the Battlestar Galactica phenomenon. Stargate had it with Stargate Universe. Hell, even Star Wars attempted to do it with the sequel trilogy. That's what The Last Jedi really was. It wanted to be darker for the sake of being darker, and it didn't really work. At the end of the day, The Last Jedi was really nothing special. And I know I'm really oversimplifying the problem with The Last Jedi, but just for the sake of argument and for the sake of time, one of the biggest issues was it tried to be a darker Star Wars movie, and it really wasn't anything special, and it really fell apart as a result, because you went from, I'm just gonna say, for sake of argument, episode 7, very uplifting, very positive, to very dark and dreary, back to very upbeat and very positive. You have a bunch of tonal shifts. I mean, even Star Trek got really campy going into the 90s. Not really Deep Space Nine, but you had Star Trek Voyager, which on paper had a very dark and gritty concept of, let's put out a Starfleet ship in was it the Gamma Quadrant, or I believe it was it the Gamma Quadrant or the Delta Quadrant? I believe it was the Gamma Quadrant. Yes, it was the Gamma Quadrant, because in DS9 the wormhole was between the Alpha Quadrant and the Delta Quadrant, so it was the Gamma. It was the Gamma Quadrant, but still, put them out in the Gamma Quadrant, where they're like 70,000 light years away from Earth, and they have to conserve their power, conserve their energy, and they have to occasionally throw out Starfleet Protocol, aka the Prime Directive. On paper, it was a very dark, very gritty concept, but in practice, they pretty much threw the baby out with the bathwater. They didn't fully commit to it, and there were parts of it where many people were criticizing that, yeah, it was very, very campy. And the first real example of Star Trek going dark wasn't, in my opinion, until Star Trek Enterprise. Obviously, dealing with 9/11, and dealing with 9/11 in the real world, but also in the Star Trek universe, dealing with the effects of Star Trek First Contact, when the Borg went back in time, because the Borg were in Star Trek Enterprise, and I can't remember the scientist's name to save my life, so I do apologize right then and there. The guy who made First Contact in Star Trek First Contact did make note of cybernetic men that came from outer space. So the popular theory is that Earth in that particular timeline was going to focus on making weapons of defense, and not really, going out and seeking peace. We have to worry about these cybernetic men from outer space. So, is modern science fiction trending toward darker stories? Yes, but I argue what is killing the genre is its over-reliance on darker stories. They need to go back to being more uplifting and positive at some point. Otherwise, you're going to have people that are just going to grow very, very jaded with the genre, because it's going to be a been there, done that scenario. Again, the modern science fiction moving toward darker stories was a natural reaction to the campiness of the 80s and 90s, but now we need to have a return to the campiness because of the darker and grittier sci-fi of the early to mid 2000s and 2010s. That's just my opinion, and who am I to speak on this subject? I'm just some random jackass on the internet, which by internet logic makes me just as capable of speaking on this topic as the next person. So guys, I'm going to surely end it right here. If you stuck around this long, thanks so much for doing so. And if you've been following me long enough, you know I'm terrible at ending these videos, so I will just see you guys next time.